Now, over the weekend, it was confirmed that Daniel Andrews' decision to force millions of Melburnians to live under an 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. curfew during the COVID-19 era was not based on medical advice. After explosive documents were finally made public, former Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton and then Public Health Commander Finn Romains exchanged emails at the time showing that although it had not been proposed by health experts, Sutton did ultimately submit to the direction of the Victorian government and supported the move. Joining me now for more on this is News Corp senior writer Patrick Carlyon. Patrick, this was a captain's call, and so many in this state, from the bureaucrats, the health bureaucrats, to members of the media, failed to question this extraordinary move. I remember I was one of the very few who was aghast by what was happening, and the response was overwhelmingly that of support from just about everyone who you would expect to step forward and question something as astonishing as forcing people to stay within their homes after 8 p.m.
That's right. Look, it's triggering just talking about this. It's almost been 5 years. And the fact was, at the time of the curfews being introduced, no other city in the world, as far as I can remember, was having curfews. There was no push for them anywhere else in Australia, certainly to the extent of Victoria. And it was plain, almost from the get-go, that this was a political decision. I think Dan Andrews made some reference to making it easier for the police force to enforce the silly rules as they were at that time. It is an absolute travesty of justice that this was allowed to pass the way that it is.
Where are all these human rights activists, yes, the Human Rights Commission, where were all these bodies that we set up, that we support with our tax dollars, that are actually supposed to step forward and say no to this sort of overreach, to this sort of, it's just dictatorship, really. The Premier just deciding on his own with his little, I guess it wasn't even a cabinet decision, it was the Premier's captain's call to impose a curfew. I mean, the man must have been on some sort of amazing power trip. Imagine that. Imagine a Premier saying, millions of people in my state, you're staying home, you're not allowed to leave.
Well, it's described as cowboy behaviour, and you look at it now in the cold light of day and you say, what the hell was that? We had protests. I mean, he was picking and choosing which protests were allowable. You had Black Lives Matter in the middle of it. Then you had the anti-lockdown protesters treated very harshly by the authorities. The public health became this sort of give or take thing according to the politics of the day in such a protracted and strident way. I mean, it really is an indictment on Victoria's history that these things were allowed to happen.
Now to the death of Pope Francis yesterday, and there is already great speculation on who will be the next Pope. Only cardinals, who are the second highest ranking members of the Church, will be able to vote, and a number of front-runners have already emerged. One of those is a career diplomat and the Vatican Secretary of State, Pietro Parolin, the second most senior churchman in the Vatican, and a Hungarian cardinal, Peter Erdo, is another one who's favoured by many. Patrick, he's expected to be fairly conservative in his outlook. Tell me about how you see the reign of Pope Francis and how the next Pope would hope to shape the Catholic Church. You would say that it's undergone some significant changes under the rule of Pope Francis. Rule may not be the right word. He was an interesting figure in that I heard a lot of Catholics who are unhappy with him as Pope and some of the things he was choosing to advocate for and some of the things he was choosing to ignore. But he did have also great support from non-Catholics.
That's right. Look, he had an activist streak, if you like, that was unlike any other pope. He was against pollution. He was against, he was very strong on climate change. He got in a bit of a fight with J.D. Vance, I think, at one point about America's immigration rules. That was all very un-pope-like, if that's a word.
Yes.
And at the same time, he failed to satisfy either the Conservatives, who he's never going to please, but he didn't please the progressives within the Church. Now, these are relative terms. I mean, when you say progressive in the Catholic Church, you'd probably throw it back to about 100 years before, where society is progressive. But he sort of had the net effect.
No, because he did have audiences with members of the trans community
Yes.
on a regular basis. He was very much outspoken, like you said, about climate change. He got involved in issues like the deportation program of certain countries.
Yes.
But then there was criticism that he wasn't outspoken enough when it came to the persecution of Christians, particularly in a number of African countries, a number of countries in the Middle East, where you would expect the Pope to be really at the forefront of that fight.
That's right. And look, he's very quiet on the church and the sex abuse stuff that's internationally happened. He really didn't stand up on that at all. You still have the impression that the church is busy protecting itself at the expense of protecting its victims. And so he was a mixed bag in that sense. He was quick to smile. He had a light way about him. He certainly internationalised the church in a lot of ways. A lot of those cardinals who will vote on the next pope are barely know each other because they're far flung from all over the world. So it's a real guess as to who the next pope will be. Perhaps what I would say is he'll be a crusty old man, perhaps with not a lot of life experience in some ways, just like every other pope. But it'll be interesting to see.
Now to the sentence of AFL star Noah Bolter. The Richmond defender was spared jail today, but he has a criminal conviction, Patrick, for assaulting a man in December. He's also received a community corrections order, which includes a 10 p.m. curfew.
Yes.
How is this going to work? Because he can't travel interstate, he can't play night games. Exactly how are the Tigers going to handle this? They've got a big blockbuster game coming up, Anzac Day Eve this Thursday. Will he be participating?
At this point, you'd think not. I imagine the club will be running around like mad trying to change his curfew. Curfews aren't good ever. Look, it's an interesting one. It's become such a public talking point, this whole discussion. Should he be banned from playing football? Should the Premier be jumping in and giving her 2 cents worth on it? Look, I don't know how the curfew will play out. That makes it very interesting.
It certainly does, because presumably he can play a Saturday afternoon game, but are they going to keep him on the list if he can play the occasional game?
Well, it's a bit hard if you have to be tucked up in bed at 10 p.m. I don't know.
It is going to be interesting to see if there's going to be any flexibility and whether that will be seen as preferential treatment for someone who's obviously a star of the AFL. Now, you mentioned the Premier. She certainly got involved in this drama. She made these comments before he was sentenced.
It's up to Richmond Football Club to explain why they've made this football decision, as parents around the country are going to sit down with their kids and watch the footy this weekend and trying to explain to their kids why this behaviour is wrong and dangerous.
So she was very upset there that Richmond were playing him. Now, that saw former Richmond coach and current Gold Coast Suns coach Damien Hardwick hit back at the Premier.
Yeah, once again, he got a suspension through Richmond, through the AFL, had a 4-week penalty. End of the day, got a premier that put her nose in someone else's business. She should just concentrate on getting the state running well. Absolute, mockery of her making comments with regard to that. But at the end of the day, he's pled guilty. He understands that. He's going to cop his fair whack.
Patrick, my God, it's a bit of a drama, this one. What do you make of all that? I guess the point that Damien Hardwick was making there is that the Victorian Premier, the Victorian government, is notorious for being soft on crime. The crime crisis in this state is a significant issue. So why she would choose to weigh in on this seems to be, well, she's opened herself up for this sort of criticism.
Yeah, look, I'm guessing there must have been some bad economic news on the day that she was saying that, because it's a great distraction, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
Everyone's been talking about it. Should she, shouldn't she have? Hardwick's jumped in on it. It's produced so many words in newspapers and so much commentary. Look,
you're a Richmond man.
I'm a
actually,
Richmond man.
We should be upfront with that. So everything you're saying is coloured by.
Yes, and Bolt had a cracking game on Saturday night in our great win. That's 2 this year. Look, it's a hard one. And if you compare it to, there's going to be 6, 8, 10 across NRL, AFL cases of players who have been charged with being violent. I mean, this one, he's probably at the lower end. The footage is dreadful.
The footage is pretty bad. I mean, this is the thing. Some of those offences weren't caught on video, but this was caught on video.
Yes, it makes a difference. It does make a big difference.
It does, and you watch that footage, it's pretty confronting. Before you go, talking about crime, the latest from the campaign trail, Peter Dutton has been talking about Australia's deepening crime crisis.
There's obviously real concern, and there certainly, it's not just here in Victoria either. And talking to a colleague in WA the other day out door knocking, it was a singular biggest issue that was raised. People just worried about crime in their own neighbourhood, and that is the case in New South Wales and in my state of Queensland and elsewhere. That's the reality.
Singular biggest issue being raised. We hear so much about cost of living. Of course, that's the top issue, but crime is very much an issue. It's seen as a state issue, but what can the federal government do about that, and should Peter Dutton lean into this issue, because it's one where he has an advantage over Anthony Albanese? Traditionally, Coalition is seen as harder on crime than Labor.
And he used to be a police officer.
Of course.
And look, there was a poll, I think, back in January that showed that climate change as an important issue had dropped off. Safety, public anxiety about safety had gone up 10% or something, like a massive amount. I don't think it's I don't think you're going to lose any votes by doing this, are you? And it does actually, in places like Victoria, it does tap into that sense that the state government has been so weak on crime that we are actually in jeopardy in our own homes. It is something that can be exploited. I don't think it's going to lose any votes. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out and whether Labor will actually sort of respond to it in a meaningful way.
Patrick Carlyon, thanks for your time tonight.